Hi guys, welcome to the first game I will show you from the Africa Super Zonal Chess Championship. This is a game from the round 1. So this game is between Abdulrahim and Sana. African Zonal Super Zonal Chess Championship took place here in Nigeria at the City Heights Luxury Hotel Ikeja, Lagos. So let's enjoy the beauty this game has to offer. White went on with knight to f3 idea. With knight to f6, c4, j6, pawn to d4, bishop to j7, knight to c3. Now we have the king's India defense, the normal variation, where the king will be castled shortly and be hidden under this fortress, the knight and the bishop performing a defensive role at the moment. After d5, countering these 2 pawns in the center. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes. Abdulrahim throws a pawn to e4 instantly, controlling vital squares in the center and also attacking this particular knight. This made Sana to react by taking the knight. Pawn takes, reinforcing the strength of the pawns in the center. Now we have these beautiful connected pawns in the center. What to do as black? Black choose to break this relationship by playing pawn to c5. The idea behind pawn to c5 is this. If pawn takes, there is bishop takes pawn check to the king, then the rook falls. However, there is still another idea with queen move here to a5, just reinforcing the pressure on the pawn, pins the pawn to the king, supporting the bishop, and the rook is also the target. At the same time, black would systematically pick up his pawn on c5 to equalize number of pawns. By doing this, he completely messed up this pawn arrangement on the queen side. Well, if white goes for a defensive approach by just adding one defender here to d2 defending this can happen. Then this pawn is still under attack by 2 pieces, the queen and the bishop. Just so you know, the pawns are not well connected anymore. So this is like a compensation on this move, like this move 9 for black, by just giving up that pawn on c5. After c5, what did Abdulrahim do? Abdulrahim chose not to push for pawn takes. He went all creative with a different concept, rook to b1. He foresaw the threat that the bishop will be extremely strong on this diagonal and the rook can be a problem in the future. So he chooses to go with this approach first. Knight comes up to c6, here d5. In this position, I do not see reason why black does not take this pawn with check. After this check, if bishop blocks the check, then 2 pieces are under attack, which is the knight and the bishop. Bishop takes with check, queen takes, then knight can now go to whichever squares he wants to go to. However, in the game, after d5, black says, okay, I'm going to use this knight to e5 approach. Knight takes knight, bishop takes. Here we have queen to d2. The queen is performing the function of defending this pawn and also creating a connection to activate a pawn along f4. Black castles. Here we have bishop. Moving the bishop from f1 to e2 makes the bishop more active on more squares compared to where it was before. And also vacating f1 enables the king to castle the short side quickly. Queen comes over to a5, mounting pressure on the pawn. If bishop can successfully take this pawn on c3, supported by the queen, then the queen here on d2 will be pinned to the king, and that's the sign of loss for white. That is why white choose to go with rook to b3. There is no harassment from the pawn because bishop will take. So rook to b3 is completely fine. Queen goes to c7. Support the bishop also, threatens to pick up a pawn. However, I saw a variation along that side. The pawn, capturing the pawn is not the only main problem in that particular area. Let me explain something. I stand to be corrected actually, but I believe if there is a random move, for example, like pawn push now, and bishop takes, rook would not take. This might provoke pawn to g3. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes with check to the king. This exposes the king, and the king lost the ability to castle. So instead of going for a move like that, white choose to continue with pawn to f4 instead. Since that square is well controlled by white pieces, the bishop, the queen, so bishop cannot take. In this position, Sana choose to play bishop back to g7. Here, white castles, rook to d8 comes up, pawn push. After a6, we see the intention of rook to d8. Rook to d8 pins the pawn to the queen. So, white will go wrong if there is pawn takes pawn. Rook will pick up this queen. And in this position, white can just simply pack his bag, the minutes on his paper, and leave the tournament because this is losing for white instantly. However, since Abdulrahim understands the position carefully, he chooses to go with an approach, bishop to b2. Well, while observing this position, I choose to look deep into it. I saw that there's a move like pawn to e5, which is also okay. This is engine friendly. It blocks out the strength of this bishop. At the same time, it's provoking black to take the pawn and pawn takes. This has reinforced this center once more by adding 3 wise pawns to the center. It is possible to play this position carefully, thereby enabling one of those pawns become queen in the future by promotion. If there's an harassment from this pawn moving to c4, rook can just come to a safe square like this. The game can continue from here. However, after e6, bishop to b2 idea comes up after a lot of thought by Abdulrahim. Pawn takes, rook goes to the only open file here in this game. This particular file is more active compared to this one and this. So it's an idea, it's a strategic knowledge which enables you understand placement of your pieces on active open files. In this position, bishop takes on g7, king takes on g7. Here we have pawn push, yf5. After a lot of thought in this position, I look at it and I said, okay, why would Abdulrahim give out a pawn in this position? There must be a purpose. Let's start with the first reply here. If pawn takes, what do you notice? There are 2 pawns now on that f file, and these 2 pawns can be a targeted weakness in the future after a lot of maneuvers in this game. Secondly, you discover that automatically the G file is now purely open against the black king. Okay, and you should also observe that this diagonal is now open to an attack to the king. So we should also include that the rook can just slide in and attack the king. That is just considering pawn takes pawn. So in this position, let's look at bishop takes pawn. If bishop takes pawn, you need to discover this brilliant move. Rook takes bishop. With rook takes bishop on the board, we are provoking pawn takes the rook. From here, a lot of things can happen. Let me show you some couple of variations. Queen check. If king goes into this hiding, hoping he is safe, there is a beautiful queen check here. This is a move that ushers in winning in series of forcing moves. After pawn push check, if the queen takes, then rook takes pawn check. If king goes in, queen takes queen, king move, and this is checkmate. In this position, after this check, it is possible to block here with the queen. Then rook takes check and the queen is off the board. This can be a planned easy win for white. In this position, after a move like this, check, and the king goes into this square g8, you can simply push this. This is the reason. You want to cut this queen away from taking the rook after rook to g3 check to the king. Here, if queen takes the pawn, then queen takes queen, is doing well. So if black says, okay, I want to keep my queen on the board, let me quickly just slide the queen to a square like this. Then rook to g3 check. King goes in. This is checkmate. Perhaps most of you will see this variation where queen check comes up. Instead of the king going to this square, let's say the king goes here, moves over to a different square entirely, h8. You can play queen check, king move. Do not forget to put d6. If queen takes on d6, queen takes queen, white is winning. If the queen goes here, then rook check is simply winning. If he goes into hiding here, this is mate. So what really happened here in this position? Sana saw this and thought for a very long time and decided to push pawn to f6. Pawn push to d6, attacks the queen. Queen goes away, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes. After the rook on b comes over here to f3, hitting this pawn and piling up pressure on that particular pawn on f6. Rook takes the bishop on e2. Queen takes bishop to g4. The sacrifice was not for long because black plans to retake this material with this variation. Now the rook is pinned to the queen. What to do? Here, rook takes the pawn on f6. Queen takes on f6. Queen takes the bishop. Queen takes on d6. Rook moves to d1, attacking the queen. After queen to f6, rook to d7 check. King goes to g8. Here, pawn push. The purpose of this pawn to h4 is to free out this king, having an escape square for the king in case of a check comes up in the back rank. At the same time, bringing fighting force into the game. Here, rook to e8 comes up. Here, queen to g3. After queen to g3, we see queen defending that square, e1. Queen goes to a1 check. King to h2. Queen comes to e5. And queen to e5 pins the queen here to the king. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes queen. King takes. We have rook. Rook comes down to attack this pawn and reduce the activity of the king, making the king unable to join this game. Here, rook takes the pawn on e7. Rook takes on c4, pawn push. Rook moves. Here we have pawn push. After the rook goes to stay under the pawn on a5, here king moves. In this position, there is a free pawn hanging here. If rook takes, rook to c7 is coming here to hit this pawn. King moves, a6. King moves, pawn moves to g4. King to f8, king to e3. Another idea if this move happens, what do you think will happen on the board? King goes to G8, king moves. Here after pawn push, king moves. King moves, we have pawn push. Pawn takes, we have king move. After pawn push, we have king move. Here we have king to C3, going after this rook. In this position, if the rook leaves A4, this pawn is gone. So king to G8 comes up, king to G, rook to G7 check. King moves, we have pawn push. After this check, king did not take the pawn. Notice how king did not take the pawn. Now let's talk about it. If king takes this pawn, then this position is a stalemate by force. Let me show you how. Rook check. You see it? King cannot take the rook. Check. King cannot. Check. Check. You see, many ideas follows. If king takes, then the king is stalemated. So in this position, king moves to B2 instead, leaving the pawn. So there can be a pawn move to avoid stalemate. After rook moves to A6, we have rook coming down back to B7 with the intention of rook takes pawn, rook to B8 check, king moves, a queen comes to the game, and white completely wins. In this position here, after this move, I think black resigned. Thank you for watching, and expect more games from the Africa Super Zonals Chess Championship 2025.